They died with their eyes open and their mouths full of ice. That's the line investigators found scribbled on the back of a mold-blackened ledger, unearthed from the basement of a building that never should have existed, a place not marked on any map, a home built for orphans. That became their tomb. This is not just another tale of 19th century tragedy. This is a buried chapter in the American psyche, one carved into frozen prairie soil, then sealed by silence for nearly 2 centuries. In the summer of 1812, 45 children vanished, not into the woods, not onto the frontier, but into the walls of a place designed to protect them, the Riverside Children's Home, 30 miles northwest of Springfield, Illinois. A stone fortress razed by good intentions and then handed, in a moment of desperation, to a man whose soul had already been destroyed by war. What followed was not a disease, not an outbreak, not an accident. It was an experiment, one so dark, so methodical, so unfathomably cruel, that the official records referred to it as methods beyond Christian comprehension. You were never meant to know about this. History buried it, institutions denied it, science can't explain it. But today, right now, we're breaking the seal. Because some truths rot in silence, and others scream to be remembered. This is the story of Riverside, the childcare home that didn't lose children. It trained them to die. The winter before it all began was unnatural. Locals called it the endless cold. Livestock froze standing in their stalls. Bread cracked in half mid-bite. Rivers refused to thaw even by June. Historians now refer to it as the year without a summer, triggered perhaps by volcanic ash from halfway across the globe. But here, in the Illinois Territory, it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. It was in that cold, in that suffocating stillness, that the Riverside Children's Home lost its heart. Mrs. Eleanina Hartwell, a widow who had raised the institution from stone and sorrow, was found dead at her desk, her hands frozen to her journal. Her last entry, a warning. The cold is not natural. The children wake screaming, but they do not remember why. Her death left a vacuum, one that would be filled not by another caretaker, but by a tactician. His name was Josiah Crane, a war-scarred militia captain with a limp, a dead stare, and a doctrine forged not in books, but in blood. He had seen starvation. He had watched boys freeze alive while still clutching their rifles. And somewhere in those lost campaigns he came to a conclusion. Comfort is weakness, and weakness must be erased. So when Crane stepped into Riverside, he didn't see orphans. He saw raw material, clay to be molded, spirits to be broken. And in his eyes, every child was either a survivor in the making or a failure to be culled. December 15th, 1811, the day the air changed inside Riverside. Crane's first order wasn't about food or beds or supplies. It was about fitness, his word for separating the salvageable from the expendable. He summoned all 47 children to the great hall. They stood in rows, trembling not just from cold, but from the presence of a man who didn't speak to them. He assessed them, like livestock. He limped in circles, eyes scanning each child. He did not smile, he did not introduce himself. "You've been softened," he said, "coddled. You mistake mercy for love. That ends now." He divided the children into 3 ranks, developing strength. The youngest, barely out of infancy. Building resilience. Those between 8 and 12, confused, but still hopeful. Proving readiness. The oldest, who knew just enough to be afraid. Each group would receive different training. Meals were cut in half, blankets were removed, heating was discontinued. He claimed that warmth made the body weak. Even the light was dimmed, lanterns removed after sundown to sharpen night instincts. But the worst was what he called endurance periods. At random hours, the children were forced to stand in the courtyard, barefoot, in silence, sometimes for hours. If they moved, they were whipped. If they cried, they were watched. And in the silence of those endurance trials, something in them began to fracture, not just their strength, but their understanding of reality. The first death was not the worst part. The worst part was how Crane interpreted it. January 8, 1812. 6-year-old Thomas Brennan collapsed in the snow. Crane had instituted a new form of resilience conditioning, barefoot exposure to cold for prolonged periods. Thomas had a cough, a fever, and begged it to be excused. Crane refused. Weakness, he said, was a choice. Thomas collapsed after 47 minutes. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he just sank, slowly, like a marionette losing strings. The other children froze in place. Mary Patterson, 14, broke formation and ran to him. She would later testify, "I thought he was dead already. His skin didn't feel like skin." Crane finally permitted the boy to be brought inside. 3 hours too late. Thomas never regained consciousness. His core temperature was unmeasurable. His fingers were blue, his lips cracked open like burned parchment. He died at sundown. Crane's journal for that day, recovered in 1987 behind a false panel, reads like the writings of a scientist observing lab rats. Subject T, Brennan, lacked internal fortitude, demonstrates failure of previous leadership. Measures must escalate. There was no remorse, no funeral, no prayer, no acknowledgement. Only this, that Thomas's death had proven the necessity of harsher methods. That night, Crane gathered the surviving children. He spoke slowly, deliberately, face lit by a single oil lamp. Thomas died because we were too lenient. That will not happen again. You will be prepared, or you will perish. They didn't know it yet, but 44 more would follow him. After Thomas Brennan's death, the descent accelerated. Crane called a new meeting in the main hall. He stood motionless for several minutes before speaking, as if forcing the children to sit in silence was part of the punishment. Then, in a calm, calculated voice, he unveiled the 4 phases of frontier readiness. Phase 1, appetite control. Phase 2, cold endurance. Phase 3, labor conditioning. Phase 4, fear management. The children stared, confused. They were orphans, or not soldiers. They had come to Riverside to survive winter, not to be reshaped into weapons. But Crane believed otherwise. To him, these weren't children. They were raw material. From that day on, the daily routine became brutal. Breakfast, a cup of gruel. Warmth, 1 blanket per 3 children. Education, replaced with hours of chopping wood, hauling water, scrubbing stone floors with bare hands. Mary Patterson, who would later testify at age 74, recalled, "We stopped crying, not because we weren't in pain, but because we learned crying made it worse." Crane kept a leather-bound log where he recorded each child's progress. A single phrase of February arrived like a blade. The snow outside deepened, but inside Riverside the cold was no longer just physical, it had become spiritual. Crane's system was no longer theory, it was law, and every child was now a subject in his readiness experiment. Phase 2 began quietly. Labor conditioning. Children, some as young as 5, were woken before dawn and ordered into the freezing dark. Tasks included chopping frozen wood with dull axes, carrying buckets of water from the half-frozen river, and hauling stones to reinforce the already solid walls. But that wasn't the point. The walls weren't for keeping winter out. They were for keeping witnesses out. Crane wrote in his log, "Labor equals transformation. Comfort equals decay. Those who serve in pain shall rise." He believed the more a child suffered now, the stronger they'd become as adults. But the reality was simple. They were dying. Emma Caldwell, age 9, became the first to resist. She was caught sharing her bread with a starving 6-year-old. Crane interpreted this as ideological contamination. Her punishment: 4 days in the stone cellar beneath Riverside. No light, no warmth, no food. When Emma emerged, her hands were blackened with frostbite. But worse than the second death didn't shock them. It was February 26, 1812. 11-year-old Martin Kowalski had been coughing blood for days. His skin was pale, his lips blue. He could barely stand. But Crane ordered him to haul buckets of water from the frozen river again and again until his legs buckled beneath him. The other children begged, pleaded. "Please, he's sick," they said. Crane's reply: "Then let him overcome it, or let it overcome him." Martin collapsed, not once, but 5 times. On the 6th, he didn't get up. His body was dragged back inside, ice forming in his eyelashes. Hours later, he was dead. But Crane didn't mourn. He recorded in his journal, "Subject M. Kowalski failed to generate internal resistance. Removal necessary. Remaining subjects require deeper reinforcement. Another death. Another excuse to intensify the process." The children were beginning to see it. They weren't being trained, they weren't being prepared. They were being culled. Mary Patterson, 14, sharp, observant, started keeping count. By March 1st, 6 were gone. Some from sickness, some from punishment. Some simply disappeared, taken downstairs and never returning. March 4th, 1812. Crane posted a new schedule on the dining hall wall: 4 rigid columns, one for food, one for work, one for punishment, one labelled introspection. But that last one wasn't what it seemed. Each night, children were led, one by one, into the study, a room once used for reading lessons. Now it was something else. A chamber for what Crane called emotional correction. No one spoke of what happened inside, but afterward the children emerged hollow-eyed, paler than before. Many cried silently for hours. Some bit their own fingers until they bled. One boy, Nathaniel, stopped speaking altogether and didn't utter a word for the next 3 years. Crane believed he was awakening resistance structures, but something deeper was happening. Children weren't just losing weight, they were losing the ability to feel safe, to speak freely, to think outside his voice. What began as a regimen of survival had morphed into something colder, religious in tone, but military in execution. Crane had begun to deliver sermons, not biblical, but personal doctrine. Pain is the father. Hunger is the mother. The world outside is the enemy. I am the bridge. He wore a black coat now, always buttoned to the top. No warmth, no softness, Mary Patterson wrote later. We stopped seeing him as a person. He was more like a law, a force, something you couldn't talk back to. And then something changed. He began talking to someone who wasn't there. He started calling the basement the hollow. And he said, "The hollow answers back now. The hollow answers." The first child to vanish was Olivia Marks, age 8, small, nervous. She had shared a bed with her younger sister and often woke up screaming, clawing at her arms. One morning, her blanket was folded neatly, her boots were by the door, but Olivia was gone. Crane's only explanation: she has been released. The other children whispered that Olivia had been taken to the hollow, the cold root cellar beneath the home. But when they peeked inside the next day, it was empty. Stone floor, dripping walls, no sign of life. And yet, it smelled different. Heavy, like wet earth, like something had moved. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 more children disappeared the same way. No sound, no struggle, no bodies. Their names were scratched off Crane's roster in black ink. Nothing else said. But the other children felt it. The nights were colder. The darkness seemed alive. Samuel Harrison, now fully broken and serving as Crane's enforcer, began keeping guard near the cellar. He told the others that Crane had spoken to the quiet below, and it had answered. Mary Patterson would later describe the atmosphere in Riverside as more like a prison built inside a haunted house. Children were no longer just afraid of Crane. They were afraid of what Crane had become, and more chillingly, afraid of what he had opened. Because they began hearing something. Not voices, breathing, coming from the stone beneath their feet. Crane stopped calling the children children. In his logs, he now used terms like units, subjects, or preparations, language that stripped them of humanity, but his writings also began referencing something else, something he never explained directly. He called it the tether. His journals from early April mention alignment rituals and threshold tests, and a repeated phrase written over and over in the margins. Strength requires sacrifice. The gate must open inward. On the night of April the 14th, Mary Patterson watched as Crane carried a lantern into the root cellar, but this time he wasn't alone. He took Jonah Price, age 10, the weakest of the remaining children. The next morning, Jonah was never seen again. What came back was Crane, covered in blood that wasn't his, and humming. From that night on, he walked differently, straighter, faster, his limp gone, his voice deeper, his eyes too bright. He began whispering to the stone walls, and they began to whisper back. Children said they heard footsteps at night, but not above them, below. Crane's nightly visits to the cellar became regular, always alone, always with one child, always returning empty-handed. Mary described it as feeding something he believed lived beneath the house or inside himself. And the terrifying part, the more he gave, the more powerful he seemed to become. It was no longer about survival, it was about transformation. By late April, only 29 children remained. But Crane no longer referred to them as survivors. He called them candidates. Candidates for what? No one knew. But the rules had changed again. He now spoke in riddles. The flesh feeds the gate. The will sharpens the blade. Only those who choose can cross. One morning, he assembled all the children in the dining hall, where no meals had been served in weeks. They stood shivering in silence. Crane placed a single loaf of bread on the table, and beside it a long iron rod, glowing faintly from fire. "You may eat," he said, "but only after the weakest among you is offered." Mary Patterson said the children stared in disbelief until Crane ordered them to speak aloud who they believed should die. At first, no one moved. Then, a voice whispered, "Emma." Another, "No." "Jacob." It spread like rot. A panic that twisted innocence into self-preservation. Terrified, starved, broken children pointing at each other to survive. Crane watched without expression, then calmly selected 9-year-old Emma Caldwell. She was dragged to the cellar. Her scream was the last anyone heard from her. The bread was never eaten. No one could touch it. That night, Crane wrote in his log, "Subject group initiated threshold judgment. Selection achieved. Result, increased cohesion among remaining units." It was Samuel Harrison who finally spoke of the cellar. Not until years later, after decades of silence and a life spent trying to forget, until forgetting became more dangerous than remembering. He described it not as a basement, but a labyrinth of punishment, carved not for storage, but for transformation. The root cellar had expanded under Crane's direction. Pickaxes, child labor, weeks of digging through frozen soil, and then etching. crude markings. Symbols, no child understood, were carved deep into the limestone. Spirals, keys, broken eyes, incomplete stars, dozens of words written backward, or with missing letters. But always the same phrase at the center. Only the prepared shall pass. In one corner, a pit had been dug, shallow but lined with bones, not all of them animal. Crane called it the tempering crucible. Children who disobeyed were placed in it, forced to recite passages he wrote himself, nonsense phrases twisted from scripture, Latin, and old military mottos. But the most terrifying part wasn't the pain. It was the silence. Crane would sit and watch them for hours, never moving, just staring, his lips moving as if whispering to something unseen. One child, 7-year-old Joseph Linley, emerged from the pit blind in one eye, muttering the same line again and again. He said, "The soil drinks strength. The soil drinks strength." Crane's log entry for that day read simply, "Contact achieved, subject broken, pit effective." By early April, the body count had reached 12. The institution that once echoed with laughter and lessons now whispered only with the sound of breath drawn in fear. And then came the 13th, a death that didn't behave like the others. Her name was Clara Morgan, age 10, small, frail, unremarkable in the records. But what happened to her was impossible to explain. Crane had designated Clara as structurally unresponsive. In his twisted code, that meant she showed no signs of improvement under his regime, no increase in pain tolerance, no aggression, no obedience. He ordered a full isolation conditioning, 6 days in the cellar pit, no food, no warmth, no light. On the 7th day, Clara was found. Not dead. Not weeping. But standing, perfectly still, arms at her sides, eyes open wide and entirely black. The other children screamed when they saw her. They said she didn't speak, that her body didn't move naturally. It jerked like a puppet, stiff and deliberate. Her fingernails were torn off, her lips had been bitten through, and still she stood. Crane's log reads, "Subject C, Morgan has entered the final stage. No fear, no hunger, no attachment. The vessel is now viable." The next day, after Clara vanished, the atmosphere inside Riverside shifted into something not even words can quite contain. The air was colder. The silence had weight. Children began waking up with scratches they didn't remember receiving. Some claimed to hear humming, a low metallic sound that came from the basement after midnight. One child, Nathaniel Briggs, began drawing symbols in the frost that formed on the dormitory windows. Spirals, crosses turned sideways, and what looked like a man's face, but with no eyes, only holes. Then, on April the 22nd, 3 boys followed Crane late into the night, watched him descend into the root cellar with a lantern and a large black satchel. They told Mary Patterson that he wasn't alone. Something else was with him. It moved wrong, not walking but floating just above the floor, and when Crane knelt before it, he didn't speak English. The boys swore it was another language, or no language at all, just clicking and gasping and long, drawn-out vowels that hurt to hear. They told no one else, only Mary. 2 days later, all three were dead. One from a fall down the stone steps, one from exposure despite being indoors. One simply disappeared. Crane didn't log their deaths. He didn't even acknowledge them, because something had changed in him too. He knew by early May, only 12 children remained. 12! And their eyes, oh, their eyes, hollowed out like light had been scraped from behind them, not in the physical sense they could still see, but emotionally, spiritually. The fire was gone. The will was gone. They moved like shadows, not children. Mary Patterson, one of the 12, began secretly recording what little she could. Bits of charcoal on strips of cloth, a crude calendar scratched into her wooden bed frame. And something else. Something she hid beneath a floorboard near her dormitory cot, a map. Not of the grounds, not of the building, a map of the ritual. She'd seen it only once, etched in red chalk on the basement stones. A circular pattern divided into 45 segments, each marked with a name. She found her own name, and 11 others she recognized. There were still blank spaces. The names of the dead had been removed, as if their sacrifice was complete. The map's center held a spiral, descending inward. And within that spiral, one word had been scratched deeper than the rest. Exitus, Latin. The act of leaving, the final door. Mary believed, knew, that the children weren't just dying, they were being offered to something. And Crane, now a skeleton in flesh, wasn't just a man anymore. He was becoming something else, something the walls themselves had begun to recognize. Stones bled at night, doors creaked open without wind, the fireplace. On the night of May the 27th, 1812, it began. Not with screams, not with fire, but silence. Total, unnatural silence, as if the world had been muted. Even the river stopped moving. Even the wolves refused to howl. 12 children lay awake in their beds, not daring to sleep. Crane hadn't spoken in 2 days. He'd stopped eating, stopped blinking. His skin had grayed like wax left too long in the sun. He spent hours staring into the cellar, that abyss he'd carved below the home, whispering in a tongue no one recognized, not English, not Latin, something older. Then the floor split. Not metaphorically, physically. A jagged line down the center of the common hall, from the fireplace to the chapel door, the stone cracked like dry bone. And beneath it, nothing. A perfect, pitch-black void. No heat, no light, no bottom. Crane walked straight to it, barefoot, muttering, "Exitus, Exitus, Exitus." Mary Patterson would later write, "He didn't fall. He was taken." One by one, the children awoke,